And we have liftoff. So this is what I call the Hydra satellite delivery system. It is capable of delivering 8 satellites into Kerbal stationary orbit, which is geosynchronous orbit, around the planet Kerbin, which is the Earth-like planet here in Kerbal Space Program. So you can see we are rapidly accelerating. And then this main engine burn is about a 1 and 20-second burn. Almost 2 minutes, actually. And we will be rapidly accelerating. Now, a couple important things to note is that up at the top, as that light blue meter gets darker and darker as we're leaving the atmosphere, there is less and less wind resistance. So that means there's more and more thrust actually being delivered by the rockets. This is a completely drone-controlled ship. There are no live Kerbals aboard the aircraft of any kind. This is really just the preliminary phase of setting up more launches in the future. I'm playing in creative mode, just having a little fun. So this rocket, it was not designed with maximum efficiency in mind. It was really just to see if I could do it. So in about 30 seconds we'll be approaching main engine cutoff, as the main engines will run out of fuel. And our Apoapsis will be well beyond that of Kerbin. And then you'll see stage 1 break away. So we are hitting max Q here, which is the max dynamic pressure exerted on the vehicle. So you can see we've run out of fuel on the left. Let things cool off a little. Make sure we're in weightlessness and have left the atmosphere before releasing the first stage so that they just gently fall away. You can see the bits of fairing protecting the satellites dropping away as well. A little bit actually gets stuck on top here. We'll zoom in and you can see that a little closer. Those little bits of fairing. If they would have ejected harder, it could have been disastrous, but they just sort of hit each other and piled up on top there. So the second engine is going to propel us into geostationary transfer orbit, which for Kerbin is about 2,863,000 meters away. 2,863 kilometers, excuse me. 2 million meters and almost 3 million meters. So we'll end up at an average speed of 1,009.8 meters per second in a geosynchronous orbit, which, in case you don't know what that is relative to Kerbin, the satellite will not move. It will face the same part of Kerbin as it launches, so the one above the ground station will always be above the ground station. As Kerbin turns, the satellite will turn in pace with it. So we're about to reach their secondary engine cutoff, and we'll check the trajectory here on our map in just a moment. Checking the fuel, turning off the non-essential systems, turning off the remote controlled stabilization to save battery power, because we are on the dark side. We're not generating any solar power right now. There's very small solar collectors on each of the satellites, but of course you need light. So you can see the bits of fairing. I'm trying to shake those off here. We'll tilt the craft back and forth just a little bit, make it wobble to sort of shake those bits off so it doesn't interfere with the second stage, or the deployment of the 8 satellites. So we're going to speed things up a little bit here. We don't want to sit here for an hour while we reach Apoapsis, which is the peak of the journey here. So we'll speed things up by a great deal, but not too much that we overshoot it. And then we'll slow time down. Up until this point, the craft's not doing anything, which is why we speed way up in Kerbin time. And so as we get a few minutes away from the Apoapsis in game time, we'll reduce things back to normal speed. Since now we can see the sun, we'll turn on our remote controlled stabilization system again. This will keep the craft from spinning wildly out of control, but also give us control assists like keeping a prograde track always facing the direction that it's moving. So in order to actually turn the craft, we have to be in regular time, which is why we reduce it down to normal speed. And then we time warp ahead so we don't have to sit here for 10 minutes while we wait for Apoapsis. Now about a minute away from Apoapsis is the time where I won't use time dilation, and I won't speed things up. This will enable you to get the perfect position before you do your burn into, we'll get as close to a geostationary transfer orbit as we can, which is that height, roughly around the 2,863,000 meters that we want to be. So you'll notice the little navigation ball at the bottom. I turn it to be level with the horizon, just for, it's really mostly for me. It doesn't have to be like that. You could be turned sideways, and you'll still be facing the same direction. But as you notice, we'll get closer and closer to the horizon, and we will cross the horizon point of the navigation ball once we are at Apoapsis. We'll have virtually no speed at that point. So you can see the counter at the top counting us down, 9, 8, 7, 6, and so on, as close to that Apoapsis as we can get. We will refire the secondary engine to burn the last of its fuel, pick up some momentum. Now this is the very important part, because as you can see here, we are not actually in orbit, and everything is going to fall straight back down into Kerbin. So the second stage is complete. There you see all the satellites release, and now you switch control to the first satellite, the first Hydra satellite relay. And then we go prograde. We lock that into a forward-facing position, fire up the engine at full speed, and just establish an orbit. We're not worried about getting into geosynchronous orbit at this point. We just want some sort of orbit so that we can switch to the other craft without having to worry about any individual satellites splashing back down into Kerbin. So we switch to the next satellite, and we'll do the same thing. We'll turn on our remote-controlled stabilization. We'll hit prograde, face forward, then fire those engines up. Get into a stable orbit, and then cut the engine off and switch to the next satellite. Now this next portion is going to speed up very quickly here, just to show that this is the same thing we're going to do over a whole bunch of different satellites. Get that one into orbit, that one into orbit, and that one into orbit. Then we'll also adjust all of these into a geosynchronous orbit in a few moments. You'll see that start to happen, even though it's extremely quick. So what you'll do is once all of your satellites are in a stable orbit, you'll just pick one. I just leave off with the last one I put in orbit, and then you put it into geosynchronous orbit. So what you'll do is you'll go to the Periapsis to adjust the Apoapsis, and you'll go to the Apoapsis to adjust the Periapsis. So if you need to shrink your orbit on the other side, you'll do a retrograde burn. And if you want to increase the orbit on the other side, you do a prograde burn. So you can see we're adjusting the opposite side of the orbit as things go on. We'll switch back and forth between the Periapsis and the Apoapsis. There are actually two smaller secondary engines that we use, and each one has a very large solar panel, just in case the battery comes over a heavier load than those tiny solar panels can keep up with. And that's it. Once the Apoapsis and the Periapsis are as close to 2,863,333 meters as possible, and doing a speed of around 1,009.8 meters per second, that is a Kerbin-stationary orbit. Now each one of these satellites is basically a battery with solar panels and a relay dish. We're setting this network up so that future launches from Kerbin with drone-controlled craft, like additional satellites to go around other celestial bodies, will be able to bounce our signal from our one ground station on Kerbin up to one of our satellites that's above it in geosynchronous orbit, then relay it off of any of the other Hydra satellites that will be in position, so that no matter what portion of the day it is on Kerbin, what time it is, or where it is in its revolution, where the ground station is pointing, we will always have signal for our crafts. This means rovers, other satellites, anything not operated by an actual Kerbal. Now I put 6 satellites in into a roughly geosynchronous orbit. It's not perfectly around the equator, but the satellites in that synchronous orbit, you know they'll never collide because they'll all be going roughly the same speed, even though they have overlapping paths, especially the point of release where they left that second stage booster. So just more of the same here. Next satellite, Kerbin stationary orbit. And this one I tilt a little bit in order to compensate for eclipses and other events. That way you have some redundancy. There's probably way more efficient ways to do this, but I prefer to manually control most of my craft instead of pre-setting up maneuvers, which you can set up ahead of time. You'll sort of notice in that view of Kerbin there that it doesn't appear to rotate from the satellite's position relative to Kerbin, and the satellite, as Kerbin rotates, it will not appear to move. Or Kerbin won't appear to rotate as the satellite rotates around Kerbin. So we put another one into a slightly eccentric orbit, and then the other 6 will remain in a relatively not eccentric orbit. I don't know how to put that. But they'll all follow roughly the same path. And you'll notice that green line, that's the communications line. You can see that the ground station is on the opposite side of Kerbin from this particular satellite that we're looking at, but we can always bounce the signal around to the one that's directly above the ground station in a synchronous orbit. And this is how you can bounce your signals around to the backside of the planet. Now, an alternative to launching 8 satellites at the same time, or even launching a whole multitude of satellites, is you could make an aircraft capable of simple landing and just put a relay dish on it, fly it to the other side of Kerbin and land it, park it, and you've got yourself another ground station. You will need at least 1 satellite in orbit at that time because you're going to need to bounce the signal around to the other side of the planet, assuming you're not using all of the ground stations. I like to use just the single starting ground station because then you get to do fun things like this. The 2 smaller boosters on the side for the small adjustments in the orbits. We'll deploy that solar panel. Get our orbits perfectly lined up here. It's a little tricky sometimes getting your satellites into geosynchronous orbit, because as you adjust your Periapsis and Apoapsis and make a uniformly circular orbit, the Apoapsis and Periapsis can drastically change as the shape of the orbit goes from an elliptical shape to something much closer to a circle. You'll see that in a couple of the satellites here, as this one rotates around as I wait for it to get into the perfect position. Excellent. This one ends up on the back side of Kerbin, but on the in almost a uniform ring. And we'll tilt this one just a little bit the other way. And again, this prevents losing control in the event of planetary alignment, in the event of eclipses, or if you find yourself simply on the opposite side of a celestial body from Kerbin, and where the ground station is located. It should minimize any gaps in loss of control. So now at this point, all the satellites are in position. We're focusing on Kerbin here. And you can see they sort of follow Kerbin around and look at the same place. Relative to Kerbin, it doesn't look like they're moving. So from here, we'll be able to launch out toward the moon there. As you can see, that's the first moon, the first satellite of Kerbin, the natural one. And then farther out, you see Minmus, which is the second moon of Kerbin. And then even if they're lined up, you should be able to reach one of those satellites. So the next Hydra launch will probably do the same thing around the moon. Not all celestial bodies you can have a geosynchronous orbit, so it's likely that the other satellites might be much smaller. You don't need nearly as powerful of engines once you are out around the moon in order to create an orbit. And you'll actually get much closer to the moon than you will Kerbin in order to have a stable orbit. And since there is no atmosphere around the moon, you can actually get closer to it as well. Have some satellites skim the surface just for fun. Now you can see here, this is the tracking station view. Kerbin time is flowing, sped up a little bit. And you can see the green lines as the communication networks. It's where they're all bouncing the signals to each other. So it's a redundant system, so in case you forget to put some solar panels on one of them or something happens where it can't charge for a while and it goes down, then you have another satellite next to it that can take its place. So thank you for watching this video, and I will be happy to post more when the future Hydra satellite systems launch to prepare us for launching live Kerbals into the solar system. Thanks for watching. Cheers.